It's almost like we've taken sort of definitely a leap forward because we're accepting risks that maybe we hadn't accepted before, in saying, oh, we're going to allow people to be home, and work remotely without direct sort of physical oversight for an indefinite period of time. And oh, lo and behold, that actually works. People are maybe even more, in some cases, more productive because they don't have a commute each way. I've said this for years, but if you do a back of the napkin calculation, it's a work month every year if you just have a 30-minute commute each way. And that's a terrible amount of time to spend away from your family or away from your job, just sitting in traffic. So there's probably going to be some environmental improvements. I think we saw that in the first few months, where we saw decreases, in pollutants and clearer skies. Maybe we can hold on to some of that going forward. I think a lot of companies have struggled with figuring out how to support remote work, and I think overall we've done a really excellent job as an economy and as a nation and individual organizations. I'm Dr. Sonny Fugate. I'm a research scientist at the Naval Information Warfare Center here in San Diego, and I lead research teams into advancing the state-of-the-art in cyber defense. At least for the last year during COVID, this tiny little office space is my current cyber Thunderdome.
Whoa! Wait, hold on. Wait, I'm gonna show you guys the cyber Thunderdome. Hold on. Cyber. I'm inside the cyber Thunderdome. That's what's up.
Schools might be able to realize that a kid taking a sick day doesn't necessarily mean they're fully checked out. It may just mean that they're at home and they're working remotely, the same way that I will work remotely in the future if I'm sick. So yeah, the tools have changed. We have far better tools. We had far better tools even weeks after the initial sort of lockdown than we had for decades, even though those tools were widely available. It's a little different for us as a Navy warfare center because of the sensitivity of some of the data that we handle and the projects that we run, and just the information. Talking about the remote work situation, we've taken a big leap forward. We are probably going to have to reckon with the cybersecurity consequences of that going forward, and that not all the tools we use are as secure as they could be, but making use of them is the only way of discovering those defects. And so it's kind of a catch-22. If you don't use a new capability, then you cannot truly know its defects, because it's not put in an environment where adversaries can see it. And by what I mean by see it in a cyber sense of, does that thing have defects that I can exploit? Does that have information I can steal? That's what cyber attackers are sort of after generally. But again, we won't know what those defects are until we take the risk of making use of the new technologies. So game theory isn't necessarily about playing games like video games, but it plays a big role in how we model interactions. So, and that can be and can guide, like a video game environment. How do I make that environment compelling? How do I make it engaging? How do I make it random enough to be interesting, right? So where I play it, and the next time I play it, it'll be a little different. Those characters will behave differently. We are applying game theory in a really interesting manner. We are thinking about interactions between defenders and attackers, using game theory to model that adversarial interaction where their interests do not align. Sometimes they're directly in opposition. An attacker is sort of going directly against the defender. Sometimes they're sort of misaligned, where they're trying to achieve different things. Generally, the defender doesn't want the attacker to do the things the attacker wants to do, but the attacker may have very different goals than the defender. So an attacker may want to steal information, or the defender might want to prevent that information from being stolen. Or it could be the attacker wants to disable the system, and the defender just wants to keep their information safe. So those are kind of weirdly aligned in a funny space. So we're actually inspired by all the work that happens in the video game industry in modeling sort of adversarial interactions. And we're trying to figure out, how can we leverage knowledge about attacker behavior, cognitive biases, susceptibility to fallacies, all of those things that we've been thinking about over the last few years, in terms of, geopolitics, and the election and fake news and all of these sort of buzzwords that have, floated around. We're thinking about those from a technical perspective. So an attacker is a human. They are susceptible to bias. Those biases can lead them down the wrong path, right? That might be more beneficial for a defender. So we're saying if we give them a house of mirrors every time they go into a network, does that mean they say, this is too hard, and just walk away? That would be a huge win for a defender. And sort of that might be one of our key goals in our research, is figuring out ways of making our network environments completely unpalatable to an attacker. So that if we just say, hey, we're using some really great cybersecurity defenses, and there's no way for you to know, in this case, one of the defenses we use is use of network-based decoys. And so a decoy looks like a real system, acts like a real system, but is not a real system. And it's instrumented, so if an attacker interacts with it, we know that they are present. And then we can take action to block them or deny them access. So in some cases, what we've shown through human subject studies is that just telling an attacker that we're using that kind of defense is enough to prevent them from gaining access or slow them down. And that's really intriguing. So it's one of those sort of key ideas where if we technically prevent them from access, that's one kind of defense. If we tell them we're using a technique, that's another kind of defense. Most conventional thinking around cyber defense is that if you tell an attacker what your defense is, it becomes less effective. But what we've shown is that for these kinds of defenses, these game theoretic defenses, use of defensive deception, defensive mimicry, by telling the attacker we're using the technique, it makes it more effective, which is awesome, because that means we can publicize, in some sense, like, hey, here's a new novel technique. And much like a strong cryptographic algorithm, knowledge of the details of that crypto algorithm is what makes it strong. Being able to give the attacker the algorithm and say, you can't break it. And if you can break it, then they'll demonstrate it, and then you'll improve the algorithm. So that's a strong defense. You want to be able to have a defense where you can say to the attacker, we're using it, and they can be like, well, maybe I don't want to touch that network at all. And if I do, well, I got to do a lot more work. And so all of those are beneficial to the defender. I think we need regulations to protect individual privacy and ensure that our data cannot be obtained or stored or sold without our consent. And sometimes that consent now is sort of sort of hidden somewhere in some EULA, right, that you sign, or some agreement, that you agree to, when you sign up for a service. I don't think that's sufficient. I think it has to be much more, much more burden needs to be placed on the organizations that are collecting data about us in terms of ensuring due diligence, that they're not losing our data, that it's not being stolen, and they're not misusing it and abusing, our trust. I think there is a sort of a sentiment that if you have not done nothing wrong, then you have nothing to hide, but that misses the point. It really is about the potential for not necessarily the trustworthy government organization that's trying to protect you. If you've got a law enforcement organization that might be able to properly use that information, it's about the miscreants who might misuse it. There's no way to guarantee that data won't be obtained by some ne'er-do-well. And therefore, any argument that says, well, if you're a good guy, then, you should be okay with these technologies. Well, yeah, okay, fine. That's moot, because the bad guys will obtain that data and they will misuse it, and that's a terrifying prospect. So again, that goes back to data privacy and regulations to guide how that information can be used and how it shall not be used. And those regulations need a lot more strength.
Able to access YouTube through those Chromebooks that they're not supposed to.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice to parents, like is there a way we can monitor that? Should we be what do you think?
That's a really good question. I think that I mean, for us, it's been mostly about being present, and I think that's key. So if you are also sort of sitting down once in a while, you know, with your school-age child and making sure that they understand the risks, and when they do something that might be a little risky, to just sort of walk them through like why that is the case, like why they shouldn't just bounce around YouTube videos. That rabbit hole leads to some pretty dark stuff pretty quickly without, you know, parental guidance. So that's what we've used. There aren't a lot of technical solutions that we can apply to, especially to those machines that are not managed by, you know, a parental control. They're managed by the school district. They've done a fairly good job of, you know, making those systems work. But it is a best effort. It's, you know, it's what the school district is able to do, right? And has the financing, the resources to do.
Yeah.
One thing we do that's a technical difference maybe from a lot of the households who may not be aware is we place all of our child's devices on a separate network. So we use a guest network, and our kids' iPads and Chromebooks are connected to that guest network because they're not as aware as my wife and I regarding the risks. So if they do end up falling down one of those rabbit holes or installing a Chrome plugin that's, you know, actually a piece of malware, that at least will prevent it from immediately infecting other devices.
That is amazing advice. I'm literally going to write that on the thing because like all of us need to do that if we haven't already. Those of us that were barely, I mean, I worked outside all the time in gardens, and now all of a sudden I'm in front of a computer or on a phone. I'm always connected to my watch, my phone, or whatever. But I found that unless I add this app and give them my, you know, access, I don't have good enough access to do the things I need to do. What's your advice for us to like do that?
Well, I love that you started with, you know, gardening because that's exactly sort of the analogy. I think it's really apt, and that if you have all these tools, you have all these passwords, you know, and every tool wants to authenticate you, you know, using your email address or your Facebook account or something else. Maintaining the security of those things is much like maintaining a garden. You've just got to regularly go in there and pull the weeds out. And that means deleting apps you don't use, turning features off for apps you do use, but they might be overreaching in terms of like what permissions you've given them. So maybe you allowed them to access your photos because you wanted to be able to upload a photo, a single photo. And then you forget that like, hey, that app has access to all of your photos. And if that app were to abuse that trust, it could give your photos or store them or, you know, lose them. All kinds of things could occur. Best practice is to go back in just as if you're gardening and pull those weeds. So check your security settings. And that takes a little bit of time, just like gardening takes a little bit of time. But it's worth it. There's some other things that are really, really good nowadays in terms of if you use a password manager, and if you don't, you should use a password manager. That password manager, whether it be Chrome and Google, or it be Apple and the Apple keychain, and there are others, will suggest to you, hey, this password has been used many times before by you. Maybe you should use a different password. And nowadays, even better, when password leaks occur, and they happen all the time. If your password is known to attackers, it occurs in one of these password leaks, these services now will say, hey, that password's compromised. You better change it. And that's a key activity for all of us to go through and pay attention to those warnings and go and update those passwords. Using a password manager means you don't have to remember the password anymore. You just need to have one big, long, strong password. Battery, horse, staple, whatever.
Battery, horse, staple, yes. Not so 1, 2, 3, 4 is not going to work.
Yeah, no, 1, 2, 3, 4 won't work. Also, two-factor authentication. We all have really strong crypto tools in our pockets in the form of a video telecommunications device or a phone. Those tools can provide you with really strong authentication for many of the sites you use. So if you're not using two-factor today, turn it on. It will save you from someone just using a cracked password and getting into your accounts. And it may not seem important for your trivial accounts, but sometimes those are ways of attackers pivoting into more important accounts. So yeah, do as much as you can, garden as much as you can. Any amount, right, will help. I think it's important to scan your devices regularly, and if you're doing any risky activities, it's crucial that you use an antivirus program. I would say pay for an antivirus program as opposed to getting a free one. The free ones come with hitches, right? They're not necessarily as free as you think. They, like many free services, are probably collecting and selling your data, which could be a social good if that data has to do with how often your machine is compromised. But you have to ask the question of like, well, is there a conflict of interest there if they're giving you a free piece of software and then making use of the data of how often your machine gets infected with malware?
Right.
But definitely, yeah. I think browser plugins are a big plus. So I think Firefox and Chrome have browser plugins that can help with privacy and security. So I can't think of any off the top of my head, but use the legit ones. So some of those are bad as well. So it's a hard place to navigate. We've chosen to keep our kids out until the fall, and that's a choice that we feel that we're able to make. We feel privileged to be able to do that. We feel that allows another child who doesn't have that privilege to be in person, and not increasing the risk by having our kids there. That said, it does mean that we have to stay engaged with the kids and be present. Without that, I don't think we could do it. I think it would be really, really hard. So I'm hopeful, right, that we'll make it work. It's also, as my wife puts it, the single largest distance learning experiment that has ever run, right? It's worldwide, it's crazy. The set of tools that we're using, is different in every different community because every school system is choosing their own collection of things. I'm hopeful that we'll have some great, smart research scientists studying this, and probably studying this for years. It would be nice if there were someone collecting data, hopefully the school systems are, on what has worked and what hasn't worked, what they've tried, what they've failed to try, maybe because of financing.
That brings me to what are you working on? Are you able to talk about it, or is it like Ben stuff all classified?
So most of my research is unclassified, and we publish a lot. So we have 8 to 10 publications a year across several different research projects. The major sort of bulk of effort for me at the moment is looking at a set of techniques that defend computer networks using what we call defensive deception. And so this is sort of taking a new look at what has been done for quite a number of years, the use of decoys or honeypots on networks. Traditional honeypots tend to be ways of trying to lure an attacker away from real systems to some place where they can be observed. We can figure out why they're there and maybe how they got into the network. In our case, we're using decoys that are a little lightweight, they're a little cheaper to run, and therefore they're more flexible in the kinds of strategies that we can think of in terms of like, well, what does this decoy do? And one of our key sort of goals is to use a decoy as sort of a litmus for, is there an attacker present? So the decoys that we're experimenting with have a presence right beside the real system. So they look and behave like real systems, and we're waiting for attackers to interact with them. Now, as a research scientist, most of the things that I work on have to do with studying, do these things work at all? How do we deploy them? And studying them with real people. So that means red teamers in a test network to say, how does a real attacker interact with a network that has decoys on it? And the insights we're gaining are really intriguing, having to do with not just that the technical method works, but the attackers are affected, in terms of their ability to perceive the network correctly. So there's a psychological impact to their being able to know what's real and what's not, or simply thinking there's deception there may slow them down. which is great. If we as defenders can take advantage of that, then we will have safer networks in the future.
Or is there a place that we could look to see where that's published? Is it like open source or?
Yeah, most of my work is up on ResearchGate.
Okay.
We can post a link. So on the screen here, I've got several different binary analysis tools. So these are tools that when someone is looking for defects in a piece of software in order to patch that software, they might use a tool like this to understand what the software is doing. So on this screen, we have a tool called Ghidra, which is a reverse engineering tool used to take a binary, which is a compiled program, turn it into and do analysis of that compiled program to understand the structure and the flow of the program as it would be if it were running, and even disassemble it and turn it back into something like source code. Now what I've done here is just take a program off of my computer and throw it into Ghidra. You can also sort of get some pretty graphs of maybe like what's called the call graph structure of that program is, and how it might be structured if we're running in memory. On the screen here, I've got a tool built by Battelle or PNNL called Cantor Dust, which is a set of visualization tools used for looking at the contents of binaries sort of from an abstract perspective. In this case, like the different patterns that might appear in the visualization might indicate different data types or different data structures, such as compressed data in the program. Over here is another tool called BinVis by Adolfo Cortesi, and this is a tool that we're exploring how we can represent the bytes of a file and in a really sort of clever, what's called a space-filling curve manner, where every byte in the file is represented by some number of little colored pixels on the screen. And what's really clever about this kind of visualization is that it's really abstract in terms of like, we don't have to do anything special to visualize a program. It works for any data whatsoever. So we can throw data into a tool like that and we get some kind of visual representation which can give us some insights into the program structure.
That's really cool.
In this case, I think the blue here is ASCII data. So this is text data in the program. Some of the colored sort of stripes patterns here might be initialization. And then the rest of this is mostly program code. So that's the actual program. Anyone has any questions about cybersecurity or cyber defense, please join us. We'll have a live Q&A on May 1st. Stay tuned for the specific time, but I hope to see you there.
All right, guys, so if you have questions for Dr. Sunny about cybersecurity, you guys should totally tune in on May 1st. Until then, everybody, stay curious and keep on sciencing.